Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili. We are DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is once again our live coordinating call featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. It's June, a bloody hot June here in Greece, and that means Pride Month, a call for unity, visibility, and respect for LGBT people. And here, oops, I'm hearing my own voice. Sorry, there we go. Little echo there. Fix. So here in Europe, let's talk about LGBT issues. Almost half of the countries on the continent still have no legal protection against hate crime based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And in many European countries, gay marriage is still illegal. Hungary has banned adoption for same-sex couples within its constitution. And Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania are at the very bottom of the pack in terms of rights and protections for LGBT people, according to the NGO ILGA Europe. But Pride Month is also the month when corporations remind us just how very queer-friendly they are. It doesn't always come across as genuine. Establishment institutions too, like the US Marines, that promoted itself recently with a picture of some rainbow bullets, while Volkswagen gave its logo the multicolored treatment and posted it across all its Instagram accounts, except in Saudi Arabia. Is Pride Month still true to its original goals of celebrating and raising visibility for LGBT people? What's the current state of that cause in Europe? And what should we, as a political movement that stands against all oppressions, be doing to advance it? These are the kind of questions I'll be putting to our panel today. You out there watching this is live on YouTube. So please, if you've got questions, comments, rants, thoughts, concerns, anything you want to throw at us, please put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. Let us kick off with Dusan Pajovic from Montenegro. Over to you, Dusan.
Thank you, Mehran. So I think that LGBTQ plus movement needs to be back to its roots. And what does that mean? It means intersectionality with class as a base for the social activism. The history of LGBTQ plus movement has been enlarged, whitewashed, ciswashed, and class-washed out of the history. Look at the Stonewall riot, for example. We need to be doing that. I don't care if Israel holds good prides, if they have really big prides in Tel Aviv, and then they go on with killing Palestinians and saying that Palestinians don't reorganize prides. We need to be intersectional in those demands, meaning that first LGBT community and then all of our allies shouldn't allow this type of pinkwashing. The same goes, for example, for vegan leather boots for Israeli army. We should say loud and clear, even though I'm vegan, I should say I don't really care if you are going to go on and kill Palestinians with those boots, stamp on their faces with those boots. Bottom line, corporations are not our friends. They are just using this for the profits. As you can see, they are not putting LGBTQ plus flag in the markets where it's not profitable. In Saudi Arabia, for example. Also, what I really need to mention is that Google advertisements let corporations to opt out of advertising for non-binary people. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't mind ever seeing an ad again, but this means that they are constantly, systemically allowing gender discrimination. And this practice proves that heterosexism and transphobia are valid to them if their consumers and customers see it as such. Systemic oppression in that way is being completely authorized by Google and other corporations. We need to call for total liberation, meaning that none of us are free if all of us are. I graduated in psychology of intercultural relations, and there they taught me about LGBTQ plus inclusion during promotion and employment on jobs, for example. The thing is, I don't want my boss to be trans, gay, vegan, whatever. I don't want them to be cis, hetero, meat eater, or anything like that. I just don't want to have a boss. And that's what we need to say loud and clear. We need to abolish hierarchies, and this is what DiEM25 is fighting for. We are also fighting for gender justice, sexual orientation justice, race justice, and equality. And those stuff will be fought for in the future as well. I also, for the very end, need to give a self-critique towards the LGBTQ plus movement. As you might assume, or as you already know, I'm non-binary man. I'm also demisexual. And I need to say that I would gladly hear and allow, quote unquote, my comrades that are, for example, cisgender, heterosexual, white, male, whatever, to express their opinions. And that is what the left LGBTQ plus activists need to do. Because a lot of people are feeling anxious, even before panels, to talk about these stuffs. As you know, my comrades from LGBTQ plus movement, gender theory is a big philosophical field. We cannot be all educated in these terms. Therefore, we need to speak freely and educate people about our identities. Of course, when I say this, I don't accept, or I don't push for people to neglect our identities or deny our identities. But we need to all together debate on the most efficient ways our rights need to be defended and put forward. And that's it from me today, at least for now.
Thank you, Dusan, for setting the scene. Ivana Nenadovic from Serbia.
Thanks, and thank you, Dusan, for setting the scene. There is a lot to cover, of course, but I will try to maybe shift a little bit to what DiEM represents, or what is our answer to the question we sometimes get, that is, why aren't we addressing enough sometimes environmental issues, or I don't know, animal rights, or being a vegan, as you said, Dusan, or other, or LGBT struggle. So I think that most important thing is also something that you mentioned, and that there is no LGBT or environmental or any other struggle without the class struggle. And that is something that I think DiEM is more broadly covering, without focusing so much on the I don't want to diminish them, but smaller issues of subgroups or minorities. So in this context of corporations using the optics when they need them, when they need consumers, from whichever spectrum they come from, there are also government PRs or optics, because, for example, in Serbia, the prime minister is lesbian, and there is literally zero contribution or improvement for LGBTQ plus community in Serbia. She even adopted a child with her partner in the United States, which is not possible in Serbia, sending a very clear message that this is just for privileged and not doing it for the community, right? The other absurd example, while we are listing countries, is in Croatia, where the abortion is being banned quite violently, I would say, in the narrative, in the media, while allowing gay marriages. So it's the optics again, and which news will be used to create the better optics for the company or the country in this case. Also, I would like to point out that in this culture of polarization, it is very dangerous to be so stuck in some, I would say, ideologies, because we can kind of call all of this ideology. and not being able to discuss it openly as long as we are not all educated enough to be comfortable discussing these topics. And I think that's the main goal, I would say, for DiEM, to be the open space and not to be self-censoring while covering these topics.
Thanks, Ivana. Johannes Baer from Berlin.
Thank you. I think I can speak a little bit from what Mera25 in Germany, our political party here, is standing for, or at least try to do that. For example, of course, as Dusan said, we want to fully fight for the rights for everyone, total liberation for everyone. So if someone is not liberated and free and has the same rights, then someone else, we're not there yet. So this is something we are struggling for. I think additionally to looking at the topic superficially, I think we're trying to connect all the different issues. If there's, for example, discrimination against LGBTQI people, we of course want to fight them and erase them, both in the legislation of the country, but also I think in the cooperation in the whole systemic structures that we live under. And to do that, I think we cannot look at single issues. We have to bring these issues together. Something like LGBTQI for the 99%, right? Where that fight is connected with the fight for economic freedom and liberty for everyone, and where also it's clear that trans women are women. You know, we're not putting one group against the other group, and we are fighting for the many, and looking at all these things also not only from a liberal perspective of saying, you know, we need to make sure that everyone has the same rights. We also need to look at it from a materialist perspective. So looking at who actually owns what, who has which kind of power. For example, in corporations, it's not enough to just see that at the level of the bosses in some corporations, we have a better representation of different people there. No, we need to look at this whole system of why bosses exist, and look at the whole structure of companies. For example, one share, one workplace, one vote, democratization, so that we can reach this liberation of everyone and not pick on a single issue that will not in the end solve all the problems that we have, including the ones of discrimination against queer, trans, different groups. So that's, I think, what DiEM25 is about, and also Mera25 here in Germany.
Thanks, Johannes. And let me just cite something from an article that Judith sent us, our colleague, who unfortunately can't join us here tonight. But it was a piece by a New York Times piece by J. Caspian Kang. And one of the things he's arguing with regard to this idea of pink washing or woke washing of corporations that we've talked about is that at the very least, it's a sign that homophobia is bad and that we agree on that. So even if perhaps it's for the wrong reasons, it still advances the debate. What would you guys say to that? Yanis, perhaps I could bring you in here with regard to this issue of corporations sending out messages which perhaps they're not doing it exactly for the right reasons, but maybe the messages themselves are not bad, and it's not bad that they're out there.
I agree. It's not bad that there are corporations that wax lyrical against racism, against homophobia, against the discrimination against lesbians and trans people and so on and so forth. That's a good thing. It's not bad at all that we have had demonstrations, for instance, in places like Bristol, that tear up statues and monuments to slave drivers and slave owners and throw them in the water. These are all, signs that there is a degree of progress. But I have to say that at the very same time, a family that, or a person, whether trans or gay or straight or whatever, who is finding it very hard to pay their electricity bill as we speak, and who can't put food on the table and doesn't know how to pay for the medical bill for their kids. The idea that a statue has been thrown into the water, or that Harvard may be considered, or Yale may be considering to change its name, or that Elon Musk is making very nice proclamations against homophobia, I don't think they're helped by that. But we should never, ever pit one discrimination against another. I think that one of the big mistakes that the left has made, I mean, the left, we have a plethora of mistakes in our past, in our record. But here are two, as an example. One is to say that discrimination on the basis of class, discrimination of labor by capital is should have a priority over discrimination over sexual orientation. That's a big mistake, because if you're a 16-year-old trans kid, you really don't give a shit about the way in which capital treats proletarians. Doesn't care. What this person cares about, what they care about, is that they go to school and they're scared, and they get bullied, and they get beaten up outside the toilets or inside the toilets. So to say to them that there is a hierarchy of discriminations, first comes class discrimination, then comes race, then comes sexual orientation, then at the bottom comes discrimination on the basis of whether you're left-handed or right-handed. That's complete and utter rubbish to the person who's suffering the discrimination. So that's one example of the mistakes that the left has made. Another example is to ignore the cross-sectionality, as Dusan said, of discriminations. The fact that there is positive discrimination for Black kids to go to Harvard is a good thing. We should defend it. We should defend positive discrimination for Black kids, or Jewish kids, whatever, or Arab kids. But at the same time, with no hierarchy, we should be very concerned that it is easier to get into Harvard if you're Black than if you're poor. So, these are two opposing errors that the left has made. One is to forget about class, and the other is to prioritize class. That's the gist of it, I think. Neither prioritize nor ignore any sort of discrimination. Two more points, if I may, Maren. One is that when you live in a society where people are forced to compete for scarce resources because of the way that the society is organized, discrimination is a natural evolutionary outcome of having to play these games. And feminists have always asked the question, why is it that women have been discriminated against everywhere? Well, because these patterns of discrimination, when we play distributional games that are zero-sum, and therefore will always have winners and losers, instead of playing cooperative games, will always select discriminatory patterns on the basis of some arbitrary convention that has to do with, taking a small disadvantage. For instance, women having to spend more time breastfeeding when men don't have to. Small differences, then magnify them. And then what capitalism does, class-based society does, these distributional games do, is there is a tendency for patterns of discrimination to divide and multiply. So the way that labor is being kept under the yoke of capital is by dividing labor between men and women, and giving, one of the two genders, usually, if not always, the male gender, a feeling that they have women under their thumb. So the way a pattern of discrimination solidifies, stabilizes, and reproduces itself is by having always somebody under you, somebody who is in a worse situation than you are, because you feel you have a certain kind of privilege, so you have a vested interest in the maintenance of a system, which in the end, all it does, it divides and multiplies the plethora of discrimination patterns. And then the last thing I wanted to say, I wanted to brag about Mera25 here in Greece, if I may, because we were the first party in Greece to have an LGBT candidate in Athens in the parliament in 2019, who remains a very active member of the party, who will be candidate again, a trans sex worker who became a trans sex worker in the 1960s, early 1960s. The oldest trans sex worker around in Greece is a candidate for Greece's parliament by Mera25. Her name is Paola Revegnoti. She has actually recently produced a fantastic film when she's walking around with other trans women of her generation who are now in their 70s, walking around Athens, recounting their lives as sex workers. And, I think that film went to Berlin at the Berlin Film Festival, but it's a film that we must promote because, firstly, it is delightful. And secondly, one of the reasons why it's delightful is because there is no culture of spirit of victimhood. Paola, she's been beaten up, arrested 1 million times, but her life is one to envy because it's full. She never lost her joie de vivre. She has produced films. She has edited journals. She maintained her connection with sex work on the street. And, for her, she's never been a victim, even though she chastises patriarchal society, capitalism, and so on. That spirit of Paola Revegnoti should be a guiding principle for DiEM25 across Europe.
Thanks, Yanis. Just while you're speaking, I've got a quick question I've got for you. If someone's watching this and they're active on, for example, trans rights issues, and they look at like Hungary last year, they banned the right to legally change one's gender. So that makes life a lot more complicated in Hungary for trans kids, trans people in general. What would then be DiEM25's answer to that in the context of what you're saying, the more sort of class-based approach to lifting everybody out of, helping people to be upwardly mobile, which hopefully will resolve many other oppressions? I mean, what would you say to them? How could we do that? What would DiEM do about that?
Well, firstly, we need to campaign against Orbán, against this law across Europe. Secondly, we need to pressurize Brussels to send the Troika to Budapest to close down their banks, right? If they close down our banks here in Greece because we dared pay 300 euros to really poor pensioners, close, I'm joking, but you know what I mean, right? They showed immense misanthropy when it came to, our government here for doing really very simple, straightforward, humanistic things. But when it comes to inhuman behavior by the Polish government, the Hungarian government, and so on, the imprisoned politicians in Catalonia, whatever you may think about Catalan independence, Brussels pretends it's none of its business. So we need to call them out. And the third thing we need to do is we need to introduce solidarity mechanisms so that if a trans person in Hungary needs to have a sex change, they should come to our country and do it for free. In the same way that women now cannot have an abortion in Texas; they have to go to to Washington or to New York State. We have to do that until we change every country.
Okay, thanks, Yanis. Dushan, you've got your hand up. Bring you back in.
No, I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Sorry, just to highlight some stuff and paint them with some examples. And to mention two things, basically. First, I really liked what Yanis said, that left is unfortunately usually like measuring oppressions, which one is harder. And that's really, really problematic. As I said, none of us are free until all of us are free. And what I wanted to say in the first part is that in Eastern Europe, for example, and in the vast majority of the world, especially Global South, LGBTQ plus issue is a class issue. So once you come out to your parents as trans, as non-binary, as gay, lesbian, you more often than not end up on the streets, especially with trans people. I know more than few of those examples in Montenegro, in Europe. We can imagine what is the situation in Global South, where majority of countries criminalize being gay. So you end up in prison for a long, long time. So it is a matter of class issue, and we need to acknowledge social categories and class categories. So focusing on social categories with materialism perspective. Finally, to put an end to that point with one very simple example, I wouldn't endorse Pete Buttigieg for US president just because he's gay. He said that the lack of baby formulas and the problem with breastfeeding and all of it is something that just need to be put up with for the purpose of free market. So it's something that we need to endure. So he's a pure example of neoliberalism, even though he's gay. And that brings me to the next point. It's much more a question of energy than pure identity and self-identification. I don't deny anyone's identity, don't get me wrong, but I need to highlight something that I said many times already. I'm probably much more of a feminine woman than Angela Merkel and Hillary Clinton all together. So it's not a matter of women representation in parliament only. We need to have a quotas for starters. But as Ivana said, Ana Brnabić, Prime Minister of Serbia, definitely didn't do anything for LGBTQ plus or women rights. So we need to see what is someone's energy, what is someone's attitudes, not just identity. Identity can be a starting point for some quotas and to have the visibility and for people to finally acknowledge that there are LGBTQ plus people around us, even though it may sound strange for some of our viewers coming from more wealthy and quote-unquote progressive countries. But what Pride did in Montenegro, I was, for example, in the coordinating collective of Pride for the last year, is that Montenegrin people acknowledged that there are LGBTQ plus people among them. They were literally saying in Montenegro, there is no such thing. That's the thing of the West before Prides. And visibility is a big point because of that. So let's all fight for all of these points, including gender identity laws, including the right to adopt children, the right for marriage, and the right to change your sex without sterilization.
Thank you, Dushan. And to pick up on something you just said, I mean, yes, it is at one level, it's important to have those kinds of legal protections, anti-discrimination laws, etc. But this is also a cultural challenge, isn't it? How there's I think Ivana spoke to this a little bit as well, but there is an awkwardness, especially with people who haven't necessarily grown up with these things and grown up with the world is changing pretty fast. I also feel a little sometimes uncomfortable that I don't have the right terminology, etc. I mean, Johannes has said LGBTQ plus, you've said LGBTQ, I said LGBT, etc. And I think that we need to be, as Ivana said, open to the idea that not everybody is in the same place in terms of their understanding and awareness of the issues that people face and the issues with queer people in general. So I think there's a cultural element to that, and that's probably a much softer form of activism that involves I don't know, how trans people, LGBT people are portrayed, for example, in film and so on. And I'm not sure that's something that we here can do. It's a shame Maya actually isn't in that because in this call, because she might have some comments on that. David Castro, Portuguese based in Belgium. Go for it.
Thanks, Merlan. Yeah, I was looking at a study today by ILGA Europe that we were talking about. That's the European LGBT Network, which this study measured the legal and policy situation in Europe with regard to the respect of LGBTQ plus people across the European Union, and not just the European Union, but also outside of it. And as it turns out, Portugal is one of the best countries in Europe for LGBT plus communities. At a legal level, at least. And that's what you're talking about now, which is, it's not just about the legalities, it's also about culture and society. Whilst laws definitely help to push society forward in terms of, what opinions are acceptable and which ones aren't. And obviously that's a good thing. What we're seeing with André Ventura and Chega is a reaction by a significant number of Portuguese people against this kind of progress, while feeling like their own economic and social conditions haven't changed all that much. And if they have changed, they've changed for the worse. By the way, André Ventura is the far-right candidate, is a member of parliament now, is the leader of the party Chega that I just mentioned. 10 years ago, they didn't even exist, just to give you a hint, and now they're the third largest party in the Portuguese parliament. So you end up with a kind of winner-loser dynamic that just pits people against one another. So yes, there's been legal and social progress at the level of LGBT, as this study confirms. But when that progress isn't accompanied by lifting the general population out of poverty and into better conditions, those people who feel like they've been left behind turn against the other, whether it's the LGBT community, migrants, refugees, it doesn't matter. They turn against anyone that they can categorize as the other, who in their eyes are the only ones who have benefited over the last 10, 15 years. That's kind of effectively what has happened in Portugal and why the far right has become the third largest party in the country. That, like I said, 10 years ago, it didn't even exist. And everyone was so proud of it that there was no racism in the country, that there was no potential for a far right victory there. Obviously, the answer, just to get to my point, the answer is not that those advancements for the LGBT community shouldn't have been made. Of course they should have. It's just that successive governments, leftist governments often, or as they call themselves, leftist, center-left, center-right, have prioritized legally trying to eliminate one form of discrimination whilst forgetting all about the other. This is something that everybody's been talking about right now. So, we either look at this as a comprehensive, holistic thing, or we don't, so that's it.
Thanks, David. A comment from the chat on what you just said. Those people who support Ventura, they were already racist and homophobic. They just found a voice to express their prejudices. Eric Edman, go for it.
Thanks, Mehran. Hi, everybody. I'm one of these really muted myself. I'm one of these really tiresome, self-hating leftists. And I'm going to use this opportunity to also lash out once again at some fellow leftists who are involved in the LGBTQI movement. And I'm specifically speaking about people from the left, progressives, who are part of the movement, not liberals who are hopeless, more hopeless than conservatives, because I'm not quite sure they even know what they stand for. But, the left, we have two big pitfalls. among others. One is, Alain Baudieu talked about the little fascist in all of us, right? And very often people in the LGBTQI movement and in the left in general are guided by this major sense of moral superiority towards society and community in general, about their positions and the superiority of their positions vis-a-vis the positions and their opinions of others, which very often results in the complete alienation of any possible future ally and the polarization of debates rather than this sense of community and this sense of trying to bring more people onto the struggle, more people onto the debate to try and inform this new society, not through force, but through discussion and through democracy and through, the sense of togetherness that one needs in order to live in a society. So that is often a very dangerous instinct that we have as leftists, regardless of whether we pursue, fiscal justice or equal rights for people, regardless of gender, sexual orientation. And that also is connected to the second thing, which is that often we miss the mark. And of course, there are plenty of liberals and conservatives in the LGBTQI movement. So it's also due to them. But often, instead of really aiming for true emancipation, the movement instead aims for, how to put it, for the right to be abused on an equal footing to everybody else. So instead of really aiming for true freedom and true emancipation from patriarchy, from capitalism, we are simply trying to get the same rights to be abused by the capitalist system as our cis, straight colleagues. And that's really missing the point into, for example, flying with Ryanair because they put, or applauding Ryanair because they put a rainbow flag on their logo, or because of their policy to not discriminate who they hire, while at the same time, being a company that completely abuses and walks over the dead bodies metaphorically of its employees. So the point here being that by missing this point, by watering down the goal of the movement, not only does it do the people that it tries to help an injustice by not truly emancipating and liberating them, but it also misses an opportunity to connect with a much broader ecosystem of other political movements that are also fighting for this true emancipation from different perspectives. So this is this link that is often missing in the framing of this particular struggle. And slowly it's encouraging to see that there is this growing realization that the struggle is bigger, that it's not good enough to settle for capitalist exploitation, but for true emancipation. And that is something that's being recognized by younger generations, but older waves of the movement have missed this mark, unfortunately.
Thanks, Eric. A comment on that, and maybe a question for you. I mean, can we not say that some of the more, this is also what Dusan alluded to in the beginning, that some of the more, let's say, liberal tactics, because our disagreement here is on tactics. We're all in favor of equal rights, but it's about tactics with certain LGBT activist groups. Can we not say that is kind of a, if I'm playing the devil's advocate, kind of like an overcorrection, which will get balanced out over time? And yes, it might be irritating, and it might rub up against rights of other groups, and it might create internal wars on the left. But at the same time, we're dealing with people who have been feeling oppressed for a long time, and things have changed very, very quickly in the last 20 or so years. So perhaps that is just that kind of overcorrection, which itself will get balanced. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it really depends on who you ask. Now, in this case, you're asking me, so I'll respond on a personal note. I think that, if anything, this particular approach delays true emancipation and is counterproductive because it mislabels the oppressors as allies. And that is problematic because it misdirects people's focus away from the people who are really the ones pulling the strings with the real social and economic power, who are maintaining this status, the current status quo. And labels them as part of the solution when in fact they are part of the problem. So that, I think, it isn't as simple as you put it. I don't think it's something that with time will then be autocorrected. I think we need to consciously be aware of these power dynamics and really integrate them in the way that we pursue real radical social change, and identify who is truly with us genuinely, morally and ideologically, and who is with us simply for profit, which means that they're with us today but might not be with us tomorrow, or are with us in America, like you said, but are not with us when we live in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, thanks. A couple of comments from the chat. Ross Coyle says, I think that polarization, the one you were talking about, is intentionally fabricated. Right-wing tabloids did a lot of it in the 1990s. Giblet says, the left has failed in many ways to rise to the challenge of the changing nature experience of all kinds of political identity. Class reductionism doesn't deal with the question. It rejects the discussion. And Creative Experiment says, don't get fooled by Tim Cook, referring to the openly gay CEO of Apple. Baral Madras, sorry, Dushan, can I bring you in after, Dushan, to respond to, and then we'll bring in Baral. Baral Madras from Turkey. Go for it.
Thank you, Mehran. I think I will give you an example from Turkey about the schizophrenic situation about gender rights and etc. The most popular two singers in Turkey are gay, and they are admired by millions of people. So I think even if majority don't accept gender rights or gay marriage or whatever the issue, when they go to concerts and see, for example, in the past, who is dead now, Zeki Müren was one of the most popular singer of Turkey. So they were, so happy to see these singers. Under Islamic rules, it is forbidden. But let's remember what happened during the Ottoman Empire. The palace had boy courtesans. It's very well known historically, very well known issue. I think there is strong resistance for the rights of LGBTQI people in Turkey too, through some NGOs. And I think the DiEM25 will be a stronghold for their goals and for their work against these prejudices. And I think the perception in Turkey is very controversial, and it needs a big reform. That's what I think for Turkey.
Thank you, Baral, for that perspective from Turkey. Dushan, let's bring you back in.
Okay, me again. Thanks. Just to answer some stuff that I really caught in my ear. What Mehran and David were talking regarding the culture and educating people. For sure, we need to educate people a lot about these issues. It's a really complicated theory, even though it's about our identities at the end of the day. And we need more visibility happening. Now, what David was talking about is really interesting, because in anthropology, it's called the overtraction theory, where if we are going too fast with some progress, there is going to be a reaction that's negative. However, what I need to point out is that we shouldn't slow down, if you ask me, because that kid who is going to be expelled out of their parents' home is certainly not going to wait in front of the door until we all just slow down a bit with progress and with education. So we need to go all in, just like we did with Black rights. So with Black rights, it became apparent in a few decades only that it's not a matter of fad, it's not a matter of, I don't know, something that's just there for the sake of it, but that it's a human right. Now, where I don't agree with Eric in large is where he said that we are trying to see who is being oppressed more, in terms of, if you are not a working class, then you are going to identify with some of the identity which is oppressed in order to feel oppressed, if I got you right. But I cannot really be a class reductionism in that terms, and I know way too many people that suffered greatly because of their identity, just to say that they went through it only to be oppressed, as it is modern to be oppressed. I don't think anyone likes to be oppressed. I think that we would all very much enjoy classless society, genderless society, raceless society, and so on. Because gender, just like race, is a social construct at the end of the day, and that needs to be abolished, if you ask me. And regarding Ryanair, I hear you and I agree, as you can assume, because I talked a lot about pinkwashing. I even did a lot of workshops in my past about pinkwashing, but I would very much state one thing, that I couldn't really blame LGBTQ plus person from Montenegro going to Ryanair because he or she or them wouldn't feel discrimination there. I mean, they felt discrimination for all of their life, in their home, in their streets, in their favorite bars. They got beaten up, called names, and so on and so on. So they would just need a bit of a break of that. And I couldn't attack them because of it. Of course, I would say that they would need to bear in mind that Ryanair is polluting the earth, that Ryanair is not treating their employees fairly. But as Yanis said at the very beginning of his speech, we need to say that even though they are rainbow washing, they are still doing something good, even because of the bad reasons. But it's far better than not doing that and still exploiting workers.
Thank you, Dusan. Important points and very nuanced. I'm not sure it works on social media the way you've put it, but it's an important point, and I like the way you say it. A comment from someone else here. Class is alive and well in queer communities. It's a reference to the debate we were having earlier. It would be better to engage and highlight that in good faith rather than create false ideological polarities that mimic the culture wars. Lucas Febraro.
Thanks, Maran. I think some great points have been made, and I wanted to go back because something that was mentioned here got me thinking a little bit. You mentioned that that article a few minutes ago. I forgot where it appeared. I think it was in the New York Times. I forgot who wrote it, but essentially it was arguing that it's a good thing that corporations are embracing LGBT rights. Is it the most sincere of embraces? You know, that's up for debate, but it's better if it's that way than if they didn't, essentially. And that got me thinking, and it took me way back to when I was a kid and I was in school in Brazil, and you were learning about our history, and a huge part of our history is permeated by the shadow of slavery, among other terrible injustices, but this is certainly the worst of all. just centuries and centuries of things that you learn, and you know, as you're a child, and it's just horrible things that were done, things that make you embarrassed of being a human being, essentially. And then I remember learning that towards the end, in the 19th century, when our colonizers were still sort of reticent about getting rid of slavery, even though all other countries in the Americas had. And then Britain stepped in, and they started blocking slave ships in the Atlantic because they really wanted to pressurize Portugal and Brazil to end slavery. And I remember thinking, well, what a wonderful thing, you know, like after all these horrors, eventually people woke up and they saw that there was a huge, terrible injustice that was being committed, and that I had to stop. And, you know, Portugal might not have seen it, but people in Britain did. And then they they went out of their way to step in and stop it from happening. And then our teacher would go, no, that's not what happened at all. It's just that capitalism was developing, and Britain wanted markets to sell its goods to it, and wanted people to buy their products. Slaves, they don't get wages, so they can buy any products. So they wanted slavery eliminated so that new markets would open up of salaried workers, essentially. And I thought of that memory sort of came back to me now, because it just sort of drives home the point that the elites in a class-based society, and especially in capitalism, they will only show solidarity or allyship when it's profitable to do so. And is it better to live in a society in which the elites are blocking slave ships instead of trading in slaves? Of course it is. Is it better to live in a society in which corporations are showing their support for LGBT rights and for fights against racism rather than the opposite? Of course it is. But I don't want to live in a society in which we have to wait until those things become profitable for the elites to, superficially anyway, to start supporting them, only to help them entrench their positions even more, so that they can obfuscate the real types of repression that are necessitated by this class-based society, any class-based society that exists and that has ever existed.
Thank you, Lucas. And this is such a vast topic, and we've only scratched the surface. But if no one else has got anything to add on LGBT issues and pride, I think we'd like to switch gears a little bit at the top of the hour and have a few words about the upcoming French legislative elections. So I know that might seem quite abrupt, because we were really getting into the debate, but we will pick this up again because it's an important topic for DiEM25, and I think we've really made some progress on it today. So Eric, can I hand it over to you to share a few words about France?
Sure. For the palate cleanser of French elections. So yeah, I mean, look, French elections coming up. Second round will be on the 19th, so the final result will be on the 19th of June. But really, here we're looking at a result, or rather at a political phenomenon that is growing in France, that is about the left in general. It's not just about the French elections, because what has happened is fairly historic. It's only happened a handful of times in France's history, and indeed probably Europe's history, is that the vast majority of left parties in the country have managed to form a single electoral union called NUP, Nouvelle Union Populaire Écologique et Sociale. So the new union, popular union of ecology and social and ecological union, whatever, excuse my French. Now, they basically have rallied around the France Insoumise, so Jean-Luc Mélenchon's political party, which means that the apparent candidate for the prime ministerial position in France of this group would be Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This is quite an important political move by Mélenchon, because it means he will not be running as the MP, and making this move quite the political risk, because if they fail to come first in the elections, then Jean-Luc Mélenchon's immediate electoral engagement as MP will be over in a matter of a couple of weeks. So it's kind of an all-in move at this stage, and quite impressive for that. Now, the bigger question here, and really where we as DiEM should come in and discuss, is, does this truly constitute a real union of the left? So what we've been talking about since our inception was this need to unify progressive forces. So when one looks at France, is that what has happened? Is that what we're looking at? And the answer, from where I'm standing at least, and I'd be interested if we have the time to jump in on this, is yes and no. Because although they've managed to create a political program of 650 policies, and in that program are really impressive fiscal policies that haven't been seen in France in a while, and social policies, and really major ecological policies as well, such as, for example, stopping nuclear energy production in France, which is a massive thing. At the same time, two things. First of all, it is rather unlikely, it's not impossible, so I don't want to be a Cassandra, but it's rather unlikely that we will ever see the materializing of this program. So it's also a question of whether they went a bit the extra mile with its with these policies. And at the same time, they also have 33 policy differences, which they have termed shades. So there are 33 shades on top of this 650 policies that they have agreed on. And these 33 shades are areas in which they could not agree when forming this agreement to run together in the elections. And one of these shades is indeed, as expected, Europe. So how to approach the European Union. And, you know, on the one hand, you have La France Insoumise, which is basically the heir of the movement in 2005 to reject the constitutional treaty, you know, the referendum that happened in France in 2005 around the constitutional treaty. And to be honest, France Insoumise has shifted a bit their message from completely anti-EU to closer to DiEM's position, which is essentially a position of disobeying and coming into conflict with the European Union, and moving forward with policy implementation, even though it might go against European Union law, and refusing to obey to rules that they consider to be antisocial. And one of the other shades is NATO. So Mélenchon had to back away from his position that he would campaign to remove France from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance in order to be able to form this electoral conglomeration ahead of the elections. And this at a time when NATO is more important than ever. We have a war in Eastern Europe, and a reinvigoration of NATO's presence. And at this moment, Mélenchon has lost the NATO topic in order to form this kind of electoral coalition. So basically, the answer is yes, there is a kind of alliance. We will never see it truly tested, most probably. So we can't really know whether or not this is more of a communications victory for La France Insoumise and the French left, rather than actual political victory, whether it is resting on solid pillars that could make a real political change in France. And very important topics were sacrificed in order to make it. So is this truly unity? The good thing is that at least they were very straightforward about the areas in which they disagree. So they didn't try to hide it, and they made it part of the narrative of this coalition, which has worked to their advantage. So, you know, to end basically with saying that it's not clear whether or not this is truly a solid political structure. My guess would be that actually it isn't, and at the first signs of pressure, it will be truly tested. And that it is a major communications victory, if nothing else, for Mélenchon and the left. It's also a huge risk, because if they don't win, Mélenchon's career will really be in jeopardy. And but it also has managed to do something that has not been done in a while in France and indeed in Europe, which is to re-energize the left and create a new sense of purpose and a new sense of plausibility and possibility for supporters of the left that might drive electoral engagement in the future. And that shouldn't be underestimated, you know, just this victory, if nothing else, to get people to think about left politics, not just as a as a side voice, but really as a main political player.
Thanks for that, Eric. Yanis, let me bring you in to have some closing words on France, please.
This coalition must be supported. I personally support it. I think that DiEM25 supports it. If we were in France, we would vote for it, and we recommend to our comrades in France to vote for it. Jean-Luc Mélenchon needs to be congratulated for managing to put it together. Having said all that, it's a creation of the electoral system. We have an electoral system in France, which is not exactly first past the post, but it's very majoritarian, which means that if the left had not banded together, they wouldn't elect more than 50 people in the National Assembly. So it was a creation of an electoral system. It's clearly an alliance of convenience. There is the program that they've put together. It is not worth the paper that it is written on. It's irrelevant. It's a lowest common denominator with lots of bits and pieces that got into there, no structure, no answer to big questions such as if you were to form the government tomorrow, what would you do about electricity prices? And to say that, that they would end nuclear energy and so on is irrelevant, at least for the next 10 years. How would you reduce electricity prices? How would you go against the target system of the European Union in terms of pricing electricity? What would you do about the European Central Bank? What should the policies of the European Central Bank be, given that we have a crazy situation? We have almost 10% inflation and minus 0.5% interest rates, which is the result of 13 years of pretending that the bankruptcy problem didn't exist. So there are no answers in the document, in this policy document, and they could never be answers, because the Socialist Party, the Greens, Mélenchon's party, the Communists, and so on, they can never agree on these things. They can never agree. They have fundamental, profound, deep-seated differences of opinion on that, and also none of them have a policy about Europe. Now, none of them have a European Green New Deal within which to embed a plan for France. But that let's be clear. Everybody in France knows that this common program is irrelevant. They had to have a common program in order to have a common ticket, and it was important to have a common ticket. So it doesn't matter. I mean, they could have ripped out a few pages from the telephone catalog, from the telephone book. It would have had exactly the same substance, Looking ahead, the situation is very clear. Okay, they're not going to win. They're going to manage to elect a lot more members of parliament than they would otherwise. And then the next day, this alliance is going to dissolve. They will go back to the parties that elected them in the first place. And you can't blame Mélenchon for that. It was the only way that the number of members of parliament that support Macron and Le Pen could be diminished. So all strength to them for doing this. But have absolutely no illusion. The day after the election, this alliance disappears, collapses, fragments. But let me finish with a hypothetical. Imagine they were to win. What would win mean? What would victory look like? Well, the absolute majority in the National Assembly. Now that would be spectacular. I wish it could happen, because Mélenchon, whatever qualms I may have about him, and you know that I do, would become prime minister, and that would throw a serious spanner in the works of the cohabitation between Macron and Mélenchon. And life would be a lot more fun if Macron's power is usurped by having to appoint Mélenchon as his prime minister. Europe would be far more interesting. But whatever happens under that hypothetical scenario, it won't be the implementation of any program. We would have a government that is constantly at odds with the presidency, with the Élysée. Macron would maintain complete control of foreign and defense policy. It doesn't matter what Mélenchon wanted to do when it comes to these things. This is how the French constitution works. And Mélenchon would have to run the economy without the levers of economic control, without monetary policy and without fiscal policy. Because believe you me, the moment a Mélenchon government is formed, interest rates on French debt go through the roof immediately, right? Not only because the financiers are going to sell bonds and reduce their price and therefore increase the interest rates that the French state pays in order to borrow money, but also because the European Central Bank will be instructed immediately to stop buying French debt or to start unloading French debt. So this is going to be, a government, a Mélenchon government, if it were formed, it would immediately find itself in a deep crisis. Now, the question is, would that give rise to the possibility of a solidarity movement across Europe? Solidarity with the new French government? Would the rest of us in Germany, in Greece, in Portugal, and so on, rally to the cause of supporting a government which doesn't have the support of its own president? Remember that. Huh? The best, in other words, we can hope for, if Mélenchon wins an absolute majority in the National Assembly, is a beautiful chaos. It's not a bad thing. Could be a splendid chaos. But that's, the only thing that the only good thing that could come out of it is that, everything will be blown up. And this normalization of stupidity, which has been happening now for years in Europe, that would implode. And all sorts of possibilities would open up, some good, some mediocre, some awful.
Thank you, Yanis. What does victory look like? Such an important question, and the essential question of strategic activism. Those words are echoing. Okay, thank you for joining us out there. We've gone past the top of the hour. We've had an interesting chat today. We've talked about corporate pinkwashing, a class-based approach to LGBT issues, the illiberal excesses of some LGBT activists, and in a totally disconnected but nonetheless very important segment, we've talked about the upcoming French legislative elections. I've obviously lost the power of speech, so I'm going to leave you very soon. We did a lot of talking on this call, but please remember, we are not just a movement of talking, we're a movement of action. And if you'd like to join the action part, then please do. The website is dm25.org/join, the website address. And in a couple of seconds, you can be a DiEM25 member and work with us on these issues. Thank you again. We will be with you at the same time, same place.